Houston, we have a problem.
Houston, we have a problem.
Those 5 words, delivered with remarkable restraint by Tom Hanks, have become more than just a line from a movie. They've entered our cultural lexicon as shorthand for any unexpected crisis. But the power of Ron Howard's Apollo 13 extends far beyond its quotable moments. Released in 1995, Apollo 13 arrived during Hollywood's fascination with historical dramas that blended meticulous accuracy with emotional resonance. This was the era of Schindler's List, Braveheart, and Forrest Gump, films that aimed to both educate and move audiences through careful recreation of the past. What separated Apollo 13 from its contemporaries was its devotion to technical authenticity, while maintaining a white-knuckle tension that kept viewers on the edge of their seats. With a $52 million budget, modest by today's standards but significant for its time, the film would go on to gross over $355 million worldwide. Critics praised its attention to detail and emotional impact, with Roger Ebert calling it a powerful story, one of the year's most exciting films. But the true achievement of Apollo 13 was something more profound. It managed to create suspense out of a historical event where the outcome was already known to most viewers. At its core, Apollo 13 isn't just a retelling of a near disaster in space. It's an examination of human ingenuity under impossible pressure, a celebration of the problem-solving spirit that defines the best of us. This film represents the perfect fusion of technical accuracy and emotional storytelling in historical cinema, a balance few films before or since have managed to achieve. As we explore this masterpiece 30 years after its release, we'll discover how its innovative filming techniques, stellar performances, and unwavering commitment to historical accuracy created not just a great film, but a cultural touchstone that continues to inspire and resonate with audiences today. So you know what makes Apollo 13 really special? It's all the crazy stuff they did behind the scenes to make it feel real. Like Ron Howard wasn't messing around, he wanted you to actually feel like you were up there in space with these guys. The zero-gravity scenes? That wasn't CGI or people hanging on wires. They actually filmed inside NASA's KC-135 aircraft, nicknamed the Vomit Comet. This plane would fly in these huge parabolic arcs, creating about 25 seconds of weightlessness each time. The cast and crew did over 600 of these dives. Can you imagine Tom Hanks, Kevin Bacon, and Bill Paxton floating around while a film crew tried to keep their equipment from flying everywhere? They'd do like 40 to 50 of these dives a day. Some crew members got so sick they couldn't continue, but that dedication shows in every frame. What's even more impressive is how they had to completely rethink traditional filmmaking for these sequences. They built special lightweight camera rigs that could be operated while floating. Cinematographer Dean Cundy and his team had to figure out how to light scenes in a constantly moving environment where they'd be weightless themselves. They ended up mounting lights directly to the aircraft's interior and developing a system where camera operators could brace themselves against specially designed harnesses. Each 25-second take had to be meticulously planned, since they couldn't just do another take immediately. They had to wait for the plane to complete another arc. The way the movie looks is pretty incredible too. Howard and Cundy went for this documentary-style approach in a lot of scenes. They used handheld cameras and this slightly grainy film stock that made everything feel like footage from the 70s. For the mission control scenes, they actually studied NASA's own documentary footage to replicate the exact camera positions and movements. They even used period-appropriate lenses to capture that slightly washed-out 70s look rather than the crisper image quality available in the 90s. And the attention to detail in recreating the spacecraft and mission control? Insane. They built full-scale replicas of the command module and lunar module, with working switches and displays. The actors were actually pushing real buttons that corresponded to what the real astronauts would have used. Production designer Michael Korenblith spent months researching at NASA's archives to ensure everything from the spacecraft interior to the astronauts' personal items was accurate. The mission control set was an exact replica, down to the brand of coffee cups on the desks. They even recreated the exact same patterns of wear on the equipment that appeared in photos from 1970. For the special effects, they used a fascinating blend of practical models and early CGI. The external space shots combined miniature models of the spacecraft, built at 1/6 scale, with digital compositing. The team at Digital Domain created incredibly detailed digital models for some sequences, but always based them on physical models first. The decision to use physical models whenever possible gives the film a tangible quality that purely CGI films often lack. The explosion sequence was done using a combination of practical pyrotechnics on a model and computer-enhanced effects to create the vacuum-like quality of an explosion in space. One of the biggest challenges was making sure everything was historically accurate. Howard brought in actual NASA engineers and astronauts as consultants, including the real Jim Lovell, the commander Tom Hanks played. There's this cool moment in the film where Lovell has a cameo. He plays the captain of the USS Iwo Jima recovery ship at the end. Lovell was on set a lot, telling stories and making sure the actors got the technical stuff right, but also understood the emotional weight of what happened. The sound design was another technical marvel. Sound designers built an audio environment that shifted between the claustrophobic, mechanical sounds inside the spacecraft and the eerie silence of the external space shots. They used actual NASA audio recordings as reference and recreated the specific radio static and transmission quality of 1970s space communications. They even recorded inside authentic Apollo-era hardware to capture the exact acoustics of those confined metal spaces. What's wild is that they actually recreated some of the emergency procedures exactly as they happened. Remember that scene where they're trying to fit the square CO2 filters into the round holes using just what they had on the spacecraft? The props team used the actual NASA manual to recreate that contraption exactly. When Ed Harris, playing Gene Kranz, dumps all those supplies on the table and says, "We need to make this fit into the hole for this using nothing but that."
To make this fit into the hole for this, using nothing but that.
Those were the exact items the real NASA team had to work with. The actors were given the same rushed instructions as the actual NASA engineers, adding to the authentic tension of those scenes. The film also pioneered some innovative editing techniques. Editors Mike Hill and Dan Hanley, who won an Oscar for their work, had to blend multiple filming styles: the documentary-like mission control footage, the cramped interior spacecraft shots, and the spectacular space exteriors, into a cohesive whole that maintained tension throughout. They studied heart monitors to time certain cuts, literally pacing the film to make viewers' pulses quicken during crisis moments. This technique has since become standard in modern thrillers. So let's talk about the actors, because honestly, this cast is just ridiculous. Tom Hanks was already on this crazy hot streak after Forrest Gump and Philadelphia, and he brings this perfect everyman quality to Jim Lovell. What's cool about his performance is how understated it is. He's not giving these big, emotional speeches. Instead, you see this trained astronaut trying to keep it together while probably freaking out inside. There's this subtle moment where they realize they have to power down the command module, and you just see this tiny flicker of fear cross his face before he goes back to being Commander Lovell. That's the whole movie in a nutshell. Then you've got Ed Harris as Gene Kranz, the flight director. Harris basically steals every scene he's in with that crew cut and those white vests. Fun fact, the real Gene Kranz actually made his own vests, and his wife made one for Ed Harris to wear in the film. The "failure is not an option"
Failure is not an option
line wasn't actually something Kranz said during the mission, but it so perfectly captures his attitude that it's become his signature phrase. Harris brings this intense focus that makes you believe this guy could actually figure out how to bring 3 astronauts home in a busted spacecraft. Gary Sinise as Ken Mattingly might be the most heartbreaking performance. Here's this guy who gets pulled from the mission he trained years for because he might get the measles, and then he ends up being crucial to saving the crew from the ground. There's this scene where he's in the simulator for hours trying to figure out the power-up sequence, and you feel every ounce of his determination. Apparently, Sinise spent tons of time with the real astronauts to get the technical stuff right, and it shows. The most memorable scene has to be when they're trying to build that carbon dioxide scrubber. The whole mission control room is scrambling, dumping out identical supplies to what the astronauts have, and racing against the clock to literally create a solution that will keep the crew from suffocating. It's problem-solving made incredibly dramatic, and you're on the edge of your seat even though, again, we all know they survived. Oh, and Kevin Bacon wasn't even supposed to be Jack Swigert originally. it was going to be John Travolta. But Travolta had scheduling conflicts, so Bacon stepped in. And now I can't imagine anyone else in that role. Bacon brings this subtle tension as the last-minute replacement who feels responsible when things go wrong. What makes all these performances work together is how they connect to the main theme. This idea that human ingenuity, teamwork, and calm under pressure can overcome almost anything. Each character represents a different piece of that puzzle, and together they show us what the right stuff really means. You know what's weird about Apollo 13? When it first came out, critics loved it, but it was kind of seen as this good drama that happens to be in space, rather than the groundbreaking technical achievement we consider it now. At the Oscars, it got 9 nominations, including Best Picture, but ended up losing to Braveheart. It did win for Best Film Editing and Best Sound, which makes sense because the technical aspects are what really shine. But looking back, it feels like people didn't fully appreciate what Ron Howard had pulled off. Like this was before we had all these ultra-realistic space movies with fancy CGI. They were doing this stuff for real. There was some controversy about how they compressed the timeline of events and simplified some of the technical problems. Some NASA folks pointed out that the real mission was even more complicated, with way more issues to solve. And they played up the tension between Jack Swigert and Fred Haise more than actually existed. But honestly, that's just filmmaking. You have to condense a week-long mission into 2 hours somehow. What's fascinating is how the film's reputation has evolved over time. Initially, people focused on the human drama, but as years passed, film schools and tech nerds started studying it as this perfect example of how to make a technically accurate film that's still emotionally engaging. Digital effects supervisors still look at Apollo 13 as a gold standard for integrating practical effects with subtle CGI. There are some cool details most people miss on first viewing too. Like, some of the external space shots actually include real NASA footage from the era, seamlessly mixed with the new footage. And those mission control consoles? A lot of them were actual decommissioned equipment from NASA that the production team restored to working condition. The film also captures the weird cultural moment of the early 70s, where America was simultaneously captivated by and kind of bored with space travel, right until it almost became a tragedy. Another thing that's changed is how we view the space disaster aspect. Back in 1995, the space shuttle program was going strong, and space travel seemed relatively routine. Now, after the Columbia disaster and with renewed interest in returning to the moon and going to Mars, Apollo 13's lessons about risk, preparation, and problem-solving feel even more relevant. It's like Apollo 13 has gone from being seen as just a great historical drama to being recognized as this perfect time capsule that captures both the technical reality and the human emotion of one of NASA's defining moments. Man, it's wild to think about how much Apollo 13 has influenced pretty much every space movie that came after it. Like when you watch something like Gravity or The Martian, you can see Apollo 13's DNA all over them. That whole smart people solving impossible problems in space genre? Apollo 13 basically perfected that formula. What I think makes it still matter today is that we're in this new space age now. With SpaceX, Blue Origin, and NASA planning to go back to the moon, there's this renewed fascination with space exploration. Apollo 13 reminds us that space is still incredibly dangerous, no matter how routine we try to make it seem. The movie shows us that even with all our technology and brainpower, things can go catastrophically wrong in an instant when you're 200,000 miles from home. The cultural impact is pretty huge too. Like I mentioned earlier, Houston, we have a problem.
Houston, we have a problem.
And failure is not an option.
Failure is not an option.
Have completely entered our everyday language. People who've never even seen the movie use these phrases. And the way the film portrays problem solving has become this blueprint for crisis management. I've heard that some business schools actually show the CO2 filter scene as an example of innovation under pressure. What really sticks with me about Apollo 13, though, is how it celebrates this very particular American spirit without being cheesy or jingoistic. It's not about America is the best. It's about what people can accomplish when they refuse to give up. There's something really powerful about watching these characters face what seems like certain death and just not accept it. They keep working the problem until they find a solution. In a world where we're facing all these massive challenges like climate change and pandemics, Apollo 13 offers this strangely hopeful message. Even the most desperate situations can be overcome with enough creativity, cooperation, and calm determination. That's why I think it's aged so well. It's not just a movie about a space mission from 50 years ago. It's about the best of what we humans can be when everything is on the line. You know what? I think that's what continues to draw people to this story. In a cynical world, Apollo 13 reminds us that sometimes the impossible really is possible if we're just stubborn enough to keep trying. As Jim Lovell himself put it in his book, there are people who make things happen. There are people who watch things happen. And there are people who wonder what happened. Apollo 13 is about the first kind, and it inspires us to be that kind too. So what do you think? Does Apollo 13 still give you that same sense of tension and amazement, even though you know they make it back safely? And what other historical events deserve this kind of meticulous, technically accurate cinematic treatment? I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the greatest historical dramas ever made, hit that subscribe button for more explorations of cinema's most influential works.